Psi-Ops is a third-person shooter from Midway. It came out in 2004 on the Xbox, PlayStation 2 and PC. I'm playing the PC version, and one interesting note about the PC version is that a free edition of the game was officially released in 2008. This version was ad-supported, and I sadly don't have this version. I did attempt to download it, but the ad server is now down, and much like Midway, I have my doubts that it's coming back. One thing to bear in mind, however, is that the PC version is a bad port, and that does colour a little bit of this review. Psi-Ops holds an interesting spot in my brain. It's a game I started out loving, went down to liking, and finally went straight to dislike over the course of my playthrough. And each time I got less invested, it happened in almost an instant. Unlike Second Sight, I'm going to be weaving the story and my observations a bit more, since I feel the story adds a lot less to this game than it did in Second Sight. If you've already played the game or don't really care, watch on. The game opens with our protagonist Nick Scryer getting mind-wiped by Mindgate, a mindful government agency. We're reminded to bear in mind that Mindgate is shady.
I've done some homework on Mindgate. Your boy's got quite a reputation and it's not all good.
Nick is getting sent to infiltrate an evil movement called the Movement, and he needs his memories wiped to do this. The Movement is being led by a man named the General. The General of the Movement, called the Movement, needs the Movement to do something we don't know about yet, and Mindgate is opposed to this. Cut to the Movement attacking a place where Nick has been planted. We immediately learn that the Movement's military tactics are a few hundred years out of date. They do pick up the slack by virtue of having psychics to do most of the heavy lifting, though. The Movement wins, probably by numbers, and Nick is captured. Now, this infiltration plan is one hell of a toss of the dice. 5 minutes in, I think both major players in this plot are dumb. Those who were captured are then lectured by the General. Nick decides to continue the tradition of stupidity. Barrett puts a halt to this, and the General decides to do something even stupider.
Well. Serve or die.
Nick is then sent to solitary. Luckily, someone recognizes him. She heads over to bust him out, gives him a pistol, and tells him to meet her elsewhere while simultaneously sodding off.
Okay, so meet up at the supply room, wherever that is. Damn, she seems familiar. But I don't know whether I should trust her or kill her. Whatever. At least she gave me a gun. It's better than a kick in the nuts.
You know, Nick's taking this turn his life has taken pretty well. At least he's got a gun. Though as we'll learn, it's pretty terrible. The game says it aids in stealth, but to just get this out of the way right now, I was never stealthy aside from when I was forced to be for all of 1 minute, and I never felt like I should have been. You haven't been placed inside the Movement so much as a mole. You're more of a bulldozer. The levels funnel you into enemies, and taking out whole areas without going loud is more trouble than it's worth. In my whole playthrough I stealth killed 2 people. Now, while you are funneled into enemies, their vision sucks and they're oblivious to you. So, stealth is basically throwing the first stone. The starting pistol isn't alone in being terrible. There are 5 weapons in this game. 3 are awful, 1 is functional, and 1 stands alone as both useful and fun to use. None of the weapons have a feeling of weight to them. The lack of satisfactory sound effects, visual feedback, or recoil makes them more like a low-pressure bullet hose. You hold down the trigger and things fall over, or occasionally and bizarrely fly away. The sniper rifle might be tolerable on the console versions. On the PC, however, it's worthless. This stems from the porting crew confusing the mouse. They think it's a confused, scurrying biological thing, rather than the sadly dead yet working piece of computer equipment that it is, which you use to aim in this sort of game. Even on the lowest DPI, using the sniper rifle is more trouble than it's worth. The assault rifle is the functional gun. Everyone else is using it, so, follow the crowd and all that. Then there's the shotgun. It's what you use the moment you find it, because, video games are meant to be fun. It's the one weapon in the game that's both enjoyable to use and useful at the same time. While the game does have sticky walls, and you can take cover and of course lean, I found that the game works best and is most enjoyable when played running and gunning. For whatever reason, when you're using cover, the camera is sucked back towards the centre. I can't think of an explanation for this outside of the fourth wall having an infatuation with the protagonist. It limits awareness of your surroundings for no good reason. The game has a lock-on feature to help with precision, but it feels like a leftover from the console version. Mouse aim lets you keep up with groups of enemies adequately enough. It's a bit too loose to really allow for precision shooting, but as long as you're putting bullets in the right direction of the enemy, you're golden. There is a 2-weapon limit in play, but you always have your silenced pistol and one long arm. And as I've said, the pistol is nigh worthless, so it's more like a 1-weapon limit with a trinket. The guns in this game overall are a sideshow to the far more fleshed out psychic powers which Nick is unknowingly heading towards. Nick's progression is a pretty odd thing. He moves pretty weightlessly in an open space, but he's got a bit of a phobia of being near edges. He's oddly opposed to them. It's most noticeable when Nick is on stairs and catwalks, where his movement becomes almost two-dimensional and incredibly stiff. Combined with the camera freaking out in tight spaces, and the fact that it's pulled in way too close to Nick, and it becomes really disorienting just to play the game at times. Climbing on things is also finicky thanks to Nick's fear of walls. This is combined with the spacebar sharing the duty of context-sensitive button. Alongside the button used to jump, alongside scaling the environment, it makes it more than a little rigid. Luckily, the only time you'll be using the spacebar is during peaceful moments, so it never cost me anything besides time. We've also got melee. It's not the most useful thing in the world, but amusing to watch for mostly the wrong reasons. These complaints are largely situational hiccups, however. Getting from A to B is largely not a pain in the arse, and even then it's very rarely because of the controls. It's a console port, so Nick's movement was made with analog sticks in mind. WASD is not as painful as it could have been. We arrive at B, and Sarah gives us a dose of psychic powers, and a keycard. Nick grabs his head and steadies himself as the camera gets really excited and we get our first of the 6 psychic powers. 5 of which we'll go over now, even though the keybind screen spoils all of them right from the off. Telekinesis, appropriately enough, carries this game. It is by far and away the most enjoyable and most in-depth mechanic. I did not tire of the simple act of throwing stuff at people, throwing people at stuff, and throwing people at people. The telekinesis is big and brash, controls well for the most part. Pick up stuff with the right mouse button, move it around with the mouse, change elevation with the wheel, quickly flick and release to fling objects at enemies. There's also the ability to double lift objects to elevate them higher, but I never found an adequate use for this beyond the tutorial. Telekinesis has quite a few tricks to it, and it's clear a bulk of the game was designed with telekinesis as the starting point. You can lift and then shoot enemies. Sadly, you can only shoot the person you're lifting, can't spread the love between 2 enemies at once, which would be awesome, and it would lend a greater fluidity to the combat. One detail that I love about telekinesis is that if you're clumsy, you can hurt yourself with it, a mild annoyance that demonstrates how powerful an ability you've got. It also ties into the weight of the world, that gives the telekinesis such a great feeling of power. You see, every enemy corpse, crate and bit of rubble actually physically impedes Nick. It's inconvenient, but it gives the world a tangibility that adds so much to the telekinesis. This may also be why Nick's movement and climbing is so awkward. The game tries to take physics objects into account so that Nick can scale them, and they're just as rigid to scale as the static parts of the level. This physicality had a funny yet originally unintended knock-on effect. You can stand on physics objects and lift yourself. Only one puzzle in the game takes this into account, which is a bit of a shame. Telekinesis does have its faults though. Putting things down lightly, and yes, you are required to do this at times, is tricky. Nick is always half-cocked and seems to enjoy throwing things as much as I do. If what you're holding is even slightly moving, or if the mouse is moving even a little bit, Nick will throw whatever he's holding away. Telekinesis does have another problem, but that's for later. Remote viewing is underutilized, and I'm not that choked up about it. As it implies, it's for looking at stuff from a distance. It may be more handy if it wasn't locked to a horizontal plane and operated more like a free camera. It has one puzzle near the beginning and then it's forgotten about. If I wasn't recording footage, I'd have never used it beyond that. Which brings up a fun point about the Hawthorne effect that we're not going into. We are going into the enemy's mind, however, with Mind Drain. Psi-Ops does not have regenerating health or power. You regain both of these via stored pickups, and up until you get Mind Drain you're dependent on Psi Vials. It adds a bit of scavenging and gives a reason to explore the otherwise limited levels. For most of the game, however, I had more than enough stuff on hand to not feel threatened. Mind Drain tries to add a reason to be stealthy. Enemies caught unaware give you more power than corpses. It falls flat because tripping someone up with telekinesis allows you to drain them. Nick is completely defenseless when draining. Considering he can lift and shoot, I'd prefer if he could fire in his offhand whilst draining to keep the combat moving. Enemies killed by explosion or level hazard can't be drained. It's kind of weird in that regard. It makes me feel like I'm rationing out cruelty, depriving myself of being a bastard at some points to fuel later bastardy. You get these 3 powers within the first hour of the game. In the following hour we get Mind Control. This ability probably has the greatest balance between its use in combat and in puzzles. I nearly always open fights by grabbing an unaware enemy and cutting loose. It's based on line of sight and has a pretty hefty range to boot, so you don't even need to be near enemies at this point.
You will need to carefully select a soldier to mind control, then kill the other soldier in the room. Okay, let's try it again.
That was not a failure. That was 200% success. All of the puzzles that require it are pretty basic, however, simply a matter of needing to be in 2 places at once. And the puzzles in general in this game aren't really challenging or cerebral. They just feel like stopgaps. In the 3rd chapter we get Pyrokinesis, and I have nothing positive to say about it. It's your outright offensive option. The problem is in how it operates. It has an incredibly short range, and cannot be fired at any angle save for dead ahead. Any changes in elevation or any obstacle in the way and it just stops. Nick's just blowing hot air. So it stops being useful in any fight where you and your enemies are at different heights, or in any gunfight beyond arm's length. And Nick got these powers so he could stop using those stupid things. Each time Nick gets a new power, we get a flashback tutorial that gives us all we need to know about Nick's time at Mindgate. And it fills us in on each power, I suppose. For what it's worth, these tutorials do not bother me. They last all of 5 minutes each, and always end with a shootout where you get to cut loose and muck about with your new ability. That's less important. A big part of the plot centers around Nick's past with Mindgate. They are presented from the first scene of the game as shady and amoral. The general is former Mindgate, along with all of the boss fights. Their reasoning is a mix of distrust with Mindgate and with ordinary mundane people, believing that their psi powers will have them used and then thrown away. The point of the word conspiracy in the title has to do with Nick also learning that Mindgate is shady and evil. A flashback at the midway point of the game has Nick horrified to learn that he was executing soldiers. But in the tutorial he does not bat an eye at how Mindgate treats their own staff.
Let's use telekinesis to throw objects at live targets. Don't worry, these guys get well paid.
I hope so.
That's gotta hurt. Those guys will never get ahead with that job.
So, is his family going to collect or what?
I don't get paid enough.
Lucky for you, your cost of living just shot down. The whole subtitle of the Mindgate conspiracy doesn't add up to much. The game treats Mindgate as a big mystery throughout, even though the gig is up 15 minutes in. Every revelation has Nick yelling, "I remember!" and then not filling anyone in on what he just remembered. Of all the psychic powers, telekinesis is definitely the star of the show. Everything else feels like an afterthought when compared. The game tries to create a good balance between their usage in puzzle solving and combat. At least that's the case with telekinesis and mind control, but your remaining powers only feel really situational, or are too awkward to really warrant use. So, we've got telekinesis, a keycard to open a formerly closed door, and no clue what's going on. So I figure I'll just pummel everything in my path until I get answers. And pummel I do. The first chapter of this game is riotously fun. You feel like something right out of a slasher movie. The first stage provides ample opportunity to be cruel with your powers and it delights in it. Fan blades, massive drops, incinerators, electrified floors, all present and accounted for. Throwing enemies is more entertaining than it has any right to be, and the game hits the ground running with it. Hell, the only thing in this space that can stop Nick are the ladders. The only way to defeat these things is with a psychic power known as the options menu, playing in compatibility mode with the VSync on in 1280 by 1024 resolution. That allows Nick to overcome this fearsome obstacle. Like I said, the PC port is not great. I'm most likely playing on the worst version of this game from a technical and control standpoint. I had about 4 crashes besides this bug. This combined with a lack of autosave did lead to some lost progress, so save often. I did play from beginning to end with nothing game-breaking in mind. Ladders defeated, the soldiers don't really stand a chance. So, we stay the course, cutting a swath through this base. Along the way learning how the movement gets loyal soldiers. It involves lobotomizing, then brainwashing, then putting them on a rack to dry. The enemies are not named meat puppets for nothing. So, it doesn't matter how silly the movement is, the rank and file is not going to question it.
I live to serve.
Then we nab some bombs, plant them about the base, and in the course of doing so run into one of the blokes from the opening cutscene, Leonov. Luckily I don't think he can see the bomb we planted, so he becomes the first boss fight. Leonov's all about mind control, so he has a bit of an enemy rush, then comes out and does some laser stuff. In both stages of the fight, telekinesis is the key. Gunfire and melee are pretty much useless, so it's a back and forth of flinging shit. Leonov loses the fight, but the cutscene disagrees. The bomb disagrees more. These are meant to destroy the base? I guess they are. First begins the escape sequence. It's a great finale to the first chapter, and it's the one case of me liking music in this game, cheesy and generic as it is. It's also the only track I can remember. It's a rush back through the stage as it collapses around you, madly flinging everything in your path to the wayside, and occasionally getting crushed by debris. Nick makes it to the helipad, and the general's there. Keeping up appearances, he acts like a twat, but breaks character when he attempts to shoot at you. Nick, on the other hand, doesn't even attempt to throw him down the tubes. They both nab helicopters and escape the base as it collapses. And yeah, the cutscenes are all awfully compressed pre-rendered video, plus no subtitles throughout. This pre-rendered video takes us to Chapter 2, the docks. Once again, Sarah tells Nick to meet her elsewhere and to try and be sneaky about it. I follow that order to the best of my ability. The dock stage is much like the opening, an enjoyable murder spree. We get mind control so it becomes the basis for much of the puzzles, and the basis for a whole lot more murder. Opportunities for cruelty are much lesser than the first stage, but still very much present. At the dock we learn about the complete destruction of Mindgate, and we find Luna 1. Funnily enough, this is the shit that Mindgate was destroyed for. The movement needs it to do something or other. With this in hand, all we need to do is leave, but Sarah wants to find her sister, and Nick's after the general, so they continue wandering about the docks in hope of running into either of those things. Nick eventually runs into Sarah again, but now she's acting suspicious.
He's looking for you.
I say that, it's the closest approximation I can get out of the voice acting. Nick hands over Luna 1.
I'll keep this safe.
Gee, I wonder what just happened.
Sarah?
Sorry, Scryer. Looks like you trusted the wrong girl.
He then sees Barrett fleeing in a jet, and gives chase. I then realised he was leaving Sarah behind and I found it funny. Then the game acknowledged this and I found it hilarious. Like, her sister has just created one of the funniest jokes I've ever seen in a video game. It's uniquely charming when absolutely every character in the game is an idiot and the story doesn't seem to realise it. That's something I can't place about this game. Does it want me to be taking things seriously, be horrified by the movement and intrigued by Nick's past, or does it want me laughing along with it? On the one hand, we've got the meat puppets, we've got Leonov, we've got gruff, bored-sounding Nick Scryer, and the game's theme song is... crap. Then we've got the General and his sheer unstoppable ham. The movement is painted as unrepentantly evil, but the game spends more time painting Mindgate as seedy. And I'm sorry, but unless Mindgate was training psychics by launching orphans and puppies into the sun alongside their normal training regime, then I'm pretty certain that they are far and away the lesser of two evils. I think the point where I just stopped treating this like a thriller and more like a Saturday morning cartoon was at the fourth boss. She's a fire boss, and all she does is make endless cheesy puns.
You really know how to get a girl hot!
The game swings from straight-faced to silly with no real discernible reason. I think the biggest issue is that nothing memorable happened outside of the gameplay. I can remember the plot in broad strokes, but nothing stood out.
I've been waiting to contact help, Agent Scryer. I'm glad you've come.
Everyone sounds bored all the time, save for the General,
Then I
and
realized
Nick,
what they...
That's no help. I remember everything now.
who sounds bored while affecting a deeper pitched voice. All the dialogue is cliché or expository.
I should have killed you when I first saw you. The best agent I ever trained returns to me as my enemy.
Train me.
Am I meant to give a shit as Nick and Sarah fight an organisation they don't know the full scale of? Or laugh as two unbelievable morons bumble about collapsing the movement because they left their all-powerful artifact lying around in an empty office? Basically, the gameplay's where it's at. The plot is there to be laughed at, both when it seemingly wants to be, and even more so when it doesn't. Nick arrives at a hidden base in scenic Hong Kong. Take it in. It's here he runs into Kamiko. She'll function as the Sarah in this scene. We learn the purpose of Luna 1. It's to aid in building the monolith. You know those psychic powers, yeah? Well, it makes them bigger. Nick's not in favour of that. Plus this base is being hidden by a master illusionist, so we're going to go and shoot her. This leads to a twisting hallway maze where the illusionist tries to torment Nick by reminding him of his past failures. Remember her, Nick? You oblivious psychic you? Then we're teleported to a graveyard and the objective screen gets way into it. We free their minds by freeing their souls by freeing our bullets from our guns. And after that we have to backtrack through Mindfuck Hallway. This is not the only case of backtracking, not by a long shot. Each chapter takes about an hour to complete. The stages are not big by any means, but they pretend to have multiple routes through them. What this generally means is, if you see a locked door, odds are you're heading back to it in half an hour through a stage that you've since cleared out. It happens in the opening base, which you end up doing 3 laps of. It happens in the docks, it happens in Hong Kong, and you'd best believe it happens in the final chapter. This leads to some very odd pacing of the gameplay. The game operates in stops and starts. You've got the fights, which I'm a fan of, the puzzles, which I'm not a fan of, and then you wander back through an empty stage. You've got a map function which did admittedly help me realise I've got to double back, but it also reveals how simplistic the maps actually are. I don't mind simplicity, in fact I welcome it in a game like this, but in this case I would have preferred it to just be a one-way trip. The backtracking does not add anything whatsoever, you're just walking back through a now empty level. It's not helped by the fact that the levels are pretty much a series of corridors with only a handful of interesting rooms in no particular order. It's a blessing that the stages are pretty small, since if you've seen one hallway on any given stage, you've seen them all. If the game were larger, navigation would most likely become a pain. The 3 environments we've had so far is Grey Military Base, Grey Dock, and Shiny Grey Secret Base. Here's a hint, the 4th environment is brown and grey. There is one puzzle that got me. Like, legit bamboozled, yeah? Before most puzzles you get a few flashes that fill out details in a room. It's obnoxious, but it ties in with the psychic theme well enough. I thought this puzzle was all about manoeuvring this plug to create a path over the electrified pool, operated with these levers. I spent 20 minutes trying different combinations, figuring out times to jump, often to my grave. I even tried filling the plug with explosives, thinking I could blow the pool and empty it. It turns out I was simply supposed to blow the fence. All this machinery was a red herring. One puzzle that annoyed me perhaps more legitimately was this one. 2 rooms at opposite ends of a hallway. One has a keycard that will open the opposite room, and that one has a keycard for the lift I need to progress. Thing is, both of these rooms have low walls that I can scale with crates. A thing I'm taught in the tutorial. The keycard to the lift will not spawn until I use the first keycard to open the door. How do I get the first keycard? Scale the wall. It's a little immersion shattering, to be frank. While I'm complaining, the sound design is fucking awful. Vases don't make this noise. Boss music doesn't loop, it just gets bored and leaves. In fact, you can open the inventory screen and get the music to leave early in quite a few areas. At some points there is no ambient noise at all. This is incredibly disorienting. You need fill noise. Even a tiny bit of background keeps areas alive, and you really don't notice this shit until it's completely gone. And did you know the only character I care about is Barrett, and it's only for his different hairstyles throughout the flashbacks? We track down and kill Illusionist Lady, and the base is revealed for all to see. The General's elsewhere in the base doing some bullshit, so we go check it out, and find him using Fire Lady to fuse some artifacts in Luna 1 or something. Sarah turns up at some point and Nick doesn't trust her.
That fragment was discovered on the moon in the 50s, Nick. The US and the Soviets both detected it and raced to get to it first.
You gave it back to this maniac?
What are you talking about? Why would I
Good
do
job,
that?
Nick. Nick doesn't like the fusion of moon artifacts. The General does, so he grabs them and scarpers. We kill Fire Lady and the base is going to explode. Kimiko stays behind to make sure the base doesn't wipe out Hong Kong, and Nick heads off for the Himalayas. Hong Kong is where I went from loving the game down to liking it. It's still enjoyable, but the level design takes a turn at this point. There's less objects to fling, less death traps to use. It's also where a new tier of enemy steps in. Armoured meat puppets are immune to psychic powers unless knocked over or set aflame. With less stuff to throw around, it tends to fall to pyrokinesis. It's like trying to crack a sentient nut that has grown arms and picked up chainsaws, and all you've got is a hammer that you're only allowed to jab with. It's an unwieldy, bizarre and unpleasant experience. So most of the time I just unload on the bullet sponges. The challenge at this point escalates, but rather than making you vary up your combat style or make greater use of your powers, the game instead limits you to your more boring options, and it loses a bit of steam in doing so. The refreshing mountain air unlocks our final power, Aura Vision. To put it short, it's a letdown. Whilst every other power has some flexibility, Aura Vision is purely contextual. It's used for puzzle solving, seeing broken walls and invisible mines. What kind of mines are these anyway? Can you gauge how close you're allowed to get for these based purely on this information? I can't. Plus they're instant kills. Have fun! I go from liking the game to disliking a single line of dialogue.
Although I've never seen it, some people say you can use AV to view things or life forms, like some kind of creatures from a different realm or something.
Okay, that's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, but I'm fucking sorry. It's just how casually this is dropped in. You've got an aura beast in my psychic throwathon, and all it's going to do is take away from the time I could be having fun. Then we go back to the Himalayas, and the stage itself validates my initial reaction to the aura beasts. You need Aura View to see these things. Whilst you're in Aura View, your other powers are locked. You need to be able to lift and carry keys to solve the pace-breaking puzzle pieces through the cave. The monsters wander all over, so you're flying blind. My advice is to just fight them head on, and clear out each room, and then do the puzzles. When you alert them, they flood in from multiple angles, and fighting them is an exercise in frustration due to their movement speed, their numbers, the awkward as fuck mouse aim, and Nick's less than stellar accuracy. They exist purely to drain resources. They're awkward to handle at best. You can use telekinesis or pyrokinesis on them, but this is even more worthless than using guns. I hate the aura beasts, and the first half of the Himalayas chapter is all about them. Sarah has been captured, her spying being less than stellar. We bust her out, and Nick is possessed by another psychic in the base.
Get out of my head!
Never mind that though, the General is activating the monolith, so Sarah goes looking for the General, and I suppose Nick does as well. Now, there is a giant spiral staircase filled with infinitely spawning aura beasts. The only way the game tells you that is to run right on in there, something you would only do if you were stupid or out of ideas. And I'm stupid and out of ideas. We rig up a satellite and it blasts psi energy into the staircase, and the aura beasts don't like that, so they leave. Throughout this chapter we're hounded by this other psychic. Again, I'm unsure if the game is trying to make him creepy. I just find him annoying.
I pierce the soul and control the mind. I control creatures from beyond our dimension.
Sarah's sister turns up. She's an evil twin. Then she leaves. This is also where we get the armoured meat puppets with rocket launchers. The few encounters we get with human enemies are appreciated, and the rocket launcher enemies make for an uphill battle, so the combat challenge is at least appreciated, because seriously, fuck aura beasts. We turn up at the boss fight with other psychic, and it's at this point I'm going to rewind and talk about all those boss fights I glazed over. The first boss, Leonov, well, he's enjoyable enough, if nothing too noteworthy. He's a test of the abilities you pick up in the first chapter. His attacks are wide and choreographed, And while gunfire does actually work against him, you defeat him mostly through use of telekinesis. The second boss, Barrett, is my favourite part of the game, and is now one of my favourite boss fights ever. His power of choice is telekinesis, and the game makes great use of this, putting the two of you in an arena littered with physics objects. It leads to a great back and forth, dodging his much larger projectiles and scrambling to grab whatever you can. It leads to so many close calls and near misses that the entire fight remains intense but manageable. It's a great example of a rival fight in a game that's not a brawler. From this point onwards, every boss in the game gets progressively worse. The third boss, illusionist Wei Lu, is an easy slog, a step down from Barrett in terms of difficulty and scale. The only source of challenge in this fight is aiming your attacks. I described the telekinesis as big and brash, but when the game asks you to be precise with it, it hits the limit of its usefulness. The problem is that telekinesis is the only way to do damage, at least in any reasonable amount, to every boss in the game. This boss wants you to pull off accurate shots with telekinesis consistently. Short of a lucky streak, that's not happening, especially under pressure. This is a problem that only gets worse with subsequent bosses. Case in point, Fire Lady whose name I can't remember. This is a two-stage fight. The first stage wants you to hit a small point on some sort of fire laser gun whilst it shoots at you. It has two attacks, one easily dodged, one a toss of the dice. It feels more like a damage rush than a back and forth. The second stage requires less precision, but becomes even more of a damage rush. Her projectiles become so much more frequent, and in a big open arena, dodging is a crapshoot. Telekinesis once again is the only way to damage her. Gunfire and melee do nothing. The best I can say for this fight is that you'd better hope your health bar and medkits outlast her. The fifth boss is supposed to represent remote viewing, but this does not manifest in the fight itself, and in the cutscenes it's more like a mint-flavoured mind control. This fight exacerbates the problems the fourth boss had, whilst adding a new problem all of its own. He uses televisions to shoot laser beams at you, and calls in aura beasts to eat you at the same time. This is like trying to rub your stomach and pat your head at the same time, whilst televisions fire laser beams and aura beasts try to eat you. It's tricky. This is actually the second boss that you can damage with gunfire. You're able to shoot out the TVs, but they have a ton of health, and if you run out of ammo for the aura beasts, you're basically done. The game wants you to pull off very precise shots with telekinesis, judging elevation of your throws and the angle, whilst under attack from two different sources. It's frustrating because every throw is a toss of the dice. The game feels at fault when I miss, which is more often than not. Then I have to fight enemies I despise for the privilege of missing again. So, while I do love the telekinesis, it's like the boss fights want me to stop having fun with it. The fact that it's the solution to every boss fight does leave a little to be desired. There's no mixing and matching of abilities, no clever gimmick bosses, just pick up and throw things until each of them ends. After he's done, we're through to the final area. Luckily this boss takes the aura beasts with him. One piece of shit is replaced with another, however. The final leg of the game is a minefield. The mines come back in fucking bulk, combined with rocket launcher meat puppets. You know what this means? Instant fucking death everywhere. The final chapter of this game took me 3 hours of my 8-hour total. And the final hallway more than half an hour alone. Instant kill mines that you can't gauge the triggering distance of. You've got inches to spare at times, and the WASD controls do not lend to the sort of slow, deliberate movement you need. You can blow up the mines with enemy corpses, but you've only got so many bodies to spare. Gunfire and psychic abilities cannot clear mines. Combine that with some misdirection, hallways littered with mines, the only payoff being meager pickups, it led to a ton of deaths. The thing is, I would forgive the mines pretty much entirely if they weren't instant kills. I hate to call something outright cheap, but these mines are. We find the General and Barrett. Barrett is then killed by the General in the symbolic murder of fun that this game had a few hours back. With this, we learn about the purpose of the movement. The General wanted to be a psychic. That's it. The movement was one man's personal power and psychic-fueled wank fantasy. The General wanted to be part of the Psi elite, which I'm guessing is a bit like the social elite, meaning the whole game is about superpowered snobbery. Sarah's sister turns up. She's an evil twin.
Sarah?
Then she dies. To the game's credit, this does lead to an intentionally amusing line.
Mom always did like me best, bitch.
The final boss fight has a gimmick. Collect 6 orbs of power to unlock the ultimate weapon, then realise it's practically worthless and just use telekinesis instead. That's it. I have nothing noteworthy to say about this boss. He just flies around spamming projectiles that are a little bit finicky to dodge, so it is once again a damage rush. This one coming down to the wire. The ultimate weapon feels more like what pyrokinesis should have been, if only it were fire flavoured. The General's defeated. Helicopters fly in, and Nick remembers everything. He'll have to tell us next time though, because this is a cliffhanger ending. Maybe he remembered the unlockable minigames. You can get these by finding gnomes. Or because this is a game from the old days, I can get them via liberal use of cheats. A friend told me about these at the last minute, so I decided to chuck this in. If you thought the tutorials were cruel, you should see what other bullshit Mindgate got up to. I don't think these would seriously extend my playtime. I had an hour of fun mucking about with them and that was my fill. Most of them are one-shot challenges, you beat them and you're done. Telekinesis and Aura Pool were fun. The bowling minigame's physics made it a bit too awkward to be enjoyable. And the Bottomless Pit challenge proved that TK surfing could have been expanded on as a mechanic. Plus it's in these challenges that you find the true final boss of the game. I'm more scared of these gnomes than I am the General. I had fun with Psi-Ops for a majority of its 8-hour runtime. The game's final chapter did sap a lot of goodwill I had for the game, taking 3 hours out of my total playtime, added up over retries and backtracking with poorly directed puzzles. It starts with a lot of promise, but it doesn't seem to understand what it was doing right. The early game where you get to cut loose with inventive and cathartic use of your powers becomes overwritten by tedious puzzles, minefields and aura monsters.